Hello and welcome to another episode of Threat Update. I'm Kilian Englert, and joining me again, as always, is Ryan O'Boyle. Ryan, how are you doing today?
Hey, Kilian. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing well.
Great. Thanks for joining. We have another pretty interesting one to talk about today. We had talked about the SolarWinds sunburst breaches and supply chain attack at the end of 2020. And I don't think anyone's really stopped talking about it since. It's been massive, and we're constantly learning new things about it. One of the newest things that we saw in an article on Bleeping Computer, and I will link to it afterwards as well too, is that an organization called SolarLeaks, I believe, is setting up an online shop to sell some of the data they claim was exfiltrated from companies as part of that breach. And I think they were advertising data from Microsoft and from FireEye and from Cisco and SolarWinds, of course, themselves too. And in that, they had a number of different things, but what I found most interesting was most of them were offering source code. So source code from Microsoft, from a number of their products, or partial source code from Cisco, from SolarWinds themselves. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Typically, and we'll dive into this a little bit, but we think about sensitive information stolen by attackers being pretty typical stuff, your PII or PHI information, credit card information, things like that. But source code's pretty interesting. Ryan, why do you think that they went after the source code, and what do you think the value is for attackers in reselling it?
I think there's two different perspectives here. In the one hand, this is their intellectual property, right? Yeah. These are software businesses, software organizations. Their code is their product. So, this could be their competitive advantage. I'm sure competitors would love to have their hands on it.
Sure.
So this is definitely big from that perspective. And then on the other hand, from a security perspective too, it'd be great for other threat actors to try to identify vulnerabilities. We keep seeing more and more about supply chain attacks, sure. And I'm sure this is not going to be the end of it. So those are definitely the two biggest concerns I had.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. And I think sometimes we get so lost in thinking about the sensitive data types, but you're exactly right. That is intellectual property. That's the life of their business. And that's a great point too with some of these, is that if you have this type of code, you can really dig through it and find potential places to exploit that in the future going forward. So that's pretty interesting and a pretty scary take on it. Ryan, anything else you want to add to any of this? So things that maybe customers who have some of this data would want to think about or consider?
It's interesting. Oftentimes in investigations, you tend to think about code being more on like the R&D side of the house, sure. Or with the developers or the dev servers, things like that. A lot of times we might even find code outside of that. People export things, people save code in user drives on public shares, places where it probably shouldn't be. Sure. So oftentimes it's quite easy for attackers to find it once they get in, and unfortunately also relatively easy to get it out. So that's a big thing that I see organizations struggling with today, identifying things like source code or other pieces of intellectual sure. property in places where they shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it just goes to show that, of course, we have to protect the common, I wouldn't say common, but the types of data that we often associate, but with cybercriminals, but we also have to consider other types as well too, like that source code, and we have to put controls around them in the same way. We have to monitor who has access. We have to routinely check why those people have access, how they're accessing the data, and make sure it looks normal for their business process, just like any other type of data. Because as you mentioned, it's intellectual property. It's the lifeblood blood of the business. Got a tongue twister there. And it could be very valuable data to steal as well. So not just the typical data types, but protecting all of that data. Ryan, anything else you want to add before we close out the video? Or do we think we've covered everything?
I think we covered most of it. I just organizations definitely to keep on the lookout for this, make sure that we're monitoring appropriately. And we're always here to help on the Varonis side. So Absolutely. Just give us a shout if you ever see something that looks weird.
That's a great way to send us off, Ryan. Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Really appreciate your time. If you enjoyed this content, please consider maybe giving us a like or subscribing to the channel if you aren't subscribed already. And if you're feeling up to it, maybe leave us a comment. Ryan and I always appreciate those. So thanks so much for watching. And Ryan, thank you for joining. Take care.
Thanks all.